The class today is titled the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. I'm Steve Chambers, the instructor. I'd like to start with a little information about me. I'm the Director of Human Resources for an international nonprofit veteran service organization. I manage all the HR functions for the organization. We have offices in Kansas City, Missouri, Washington, D.C., and small offices located around the U.S. I have taught at the college level in the classroom since 2002 and online since 2013. I teach human resource curriculum for undergraduate and graduate level courses. I hold a master's degree in HR management, and I hold a master's degree in employment law. My undergraduate degree is also in HR management. I hold HR profession certifications, PHR, which is Professional of Human Resources, and a SHRM CP, which is Society for Human Resource Management Certified Professional. Here's the agenda for the class today. What is the Fair Labor Standards Act? Who does the Fair Labor Standards Act cover? What does it cover? We're going to talk about exempt and non-exempt employees, minimum wage and overtime, hours worked, child labor, and record-keeping requirements. Here's the objectives for you today. You'll be able to comply with basic requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act, determine whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt, apply the FLSA hours worked and overtime requirements to workers, and identify and observe child labor restrictions. What is the Fair Labor Standards Act? It's a federal law that governs minimum wage, overtime, record-keeping, and child labor requirements and restrictions. It was passed by Congress in 1938 and has been amended 5 times, with the last one in August of 2005. Back in 1938, the Congress saw that there was a great need for labor laws protecting workers, especially children, from abuse from employers. This was the time during the Great Depression, just before World War II broke out. They also call it the overtime law, but it focuses on much more than that, as you can see. What does it cover? As I mentioned, basic minimum wage and overtime, hours worked, child labor, working conditions, and record-keeping requirements. There's always record-keeping requirements with federal laws. Who does it cover? As you can see, enterprises with at least 2 employees who engage in interstate commerce. That's certainly an important part of it, is interstate commerce, not intrastate. Produces goods and services for the commerce, has an annual volume of business of $500,000 or more. But regardless of the dollar amount, it also applies to hospitals, business providing medical and nursing care, for schools, preschools, and government agencies. So it covers most everyone, which ends up being about 130 million workers. Just about everyone is covered, as I said. Probably an example, maybe one-person business that buys and sells local and does not engage in interstate business at all. That's probably an exception to that. Here's exempt and non-exempt employees. This confuses people, but it's fairly straightforward. Exempt employees are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime rule. In other words, they're exempt or immune from that overtime rule. Non-exempt means they're not, which is the opposite, and they are covered by the time and a half overtime rule. It's pretty simple. Here's some exempt employee categories. First, the executive, which is management of the enterprise or organization, and they regularly direct 2 or more employees and have the authority to hire and fire. The administrative category performs office work and non-manual work directly related to management, and or exercises discretion and independent judgment. Here's a couple more. The learned professionals performs work requiring advanced knowledge in the field of science or learning. And examples of that are doctors, lawyers, and college professors. And then the fourth one is outside sales. They make sales and obtain orders or contracts or services for which consideration will be paid for by the customer. and customarily engaged away from the employer's place of business, therefore outside sales. Let's talk about the minimum wage. The minimum wage applies to all non-exempt employees, so it doesn't apply to exempt employees. However, the Fair Labor Standards Act minimum wage requirements are superseded by state laws that are more favorable to employees. Therefore, when a state's minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum wage, employers are obligated to pay the higher rate, which makes sense. As you can see, the current minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is effective back in 2009. The state of Kansas minimum wage is also $7.25, and the state of Kansas usually follows what the federal minimum wage is. Other states and locales have various minimum wage rates, though. Takes, for example, Missouri. Their state minimum wage is $7.70 per hour, but Kansas City and St. Louis want to raise their own minimum wages in their locales to $10 and $13 an hour. So it varies, and it varies around the United States also. Now, the overtime wage. This applies to non-exempt employees that must be paid their time and a half or 1.5 times of the regular rate of pay for everything worked over 40 hours. Now, each work week stands on its own, regardless of whether employees are paid on a weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, or monthly basis. 2 or more work weeks cannot be averaged for the purpose of calculating overtime. Holidays, vacation days, and sick days aren't counted in the overtime. It doesn't matter if the employee gets paid regular pay for these days. For overtime, it's only hours worked that are counted, not hours paid. On-call and travel time may be included in the overtime. As you can see, compliance is determined by the work week, and each work week stands by itself again. Work week is 7 consecutive 24-hour periods, or 168 hours, and it's determined by the employer. For example, my organization, our work week is Sunday through Saturday, which a lot are. Hours worked. I know that those terms might be funny. Suffered or permitted. It's work not requested, but suffered or permitted is work for non-exempt employees, which must be paid. It's regular work hours, in other words. But it also includes waiting time, on-call time, meal and rest periods, training time, travel time, and sleep time. Here's some child labor requirements. This is very important because these are ones that can get your business in trouble quickly. There are work restrictions for all minors under 18. Normally, all employees, including minors, must be paid at least the federal minimum wage. Minors who work overtime have to get paid the time and a half hours. Hours of work, no restrictions for minors who are 16 or 17. So you can work them plenty of hours, including overtime. However, there are restrictions for minors who are 14 and 15. And then, of course, you have to have the proof of age. You have to ask them and show identification of how old they are. So you might have a youngster that's 15 years old, says he's 16, and you're going to be on the hook for trouble like that. You know, they're talking about work restrictions for minors under age 18. All minors under age 18 are prohibited from performing particularly hazardous jobs that are detrimental to their health or well-being. You know, dealing with hazardous materials, toxic chemicals, that's all restricted. And then there are also the hours restrictions that I mentioned on the 14 and 15-year-olds. So outside school hours for 18 hours during any week when school's in session, not any more than 18. 40 hours during a week when school's not in session. So you can work on 40 hours a week in the summertime. And for 3 hours during any day when school's in session, or 8 hours on a day when school's not in session. So there are some requirements to keep you from overworking child labor. Now, record-keeping requirements. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, we are required to retain general employee files containing information such as the employee's age, sex, address, and occupation. These records must be kept at least 3 years. Basic employment and earning records, including payroll deductions, evaluations, job descriptions, must be kept for at least 2 years. Records for employees who earn tips as part of their compensation must be kept for a period of 3 years and should include the time paid for hours worked each day and tips received and accounted for or turned over to the employer. And finally, it's important to note that these time periods are minimum time periods. To be safe, most required employment records should be kept at least for a few years longer than the legal minimum requirement. Okay, now we've come to the assessment part where you can be the HR manager. Here's question number 1. Do you think a machinist with no supervisory duties is exempt from overtime pay? Just think about what we've talked about with exempt and non-exempt employees. Just take your time, write down the answer there. Question 2. Is an entry-level Overland Park Quick Trip store clerk making $7 an hour? Is that the correct wage? Again, think about what we've talked about on the minimum wage in Kansas. Okay, here's another question. Question 3. My employee works 80 hours a pay period, 36 hours the first week and 44 hours the second week of the pay period. So I don't have to pay overtime. Is that right? Think about the overtime, the weeks. And then question 4. I have a 15-year-old employee working from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. during the school week. Can I work this employee those hours? I just covered child labor and 14 and 15-year-old restrictions. So take a look at that, formulate your answer, and then write it down. Okay, here's the answers. Under question 1, no, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, an employee is in a non-supervisory role, and that job classification is not exempt from overtime. So, in other words, they have to pay overtime. Question 2, no, the minimum wage for Overland Park, Kansas is $7.25 per hour. So if Quick Trip was paying that employee $7 an hour, they could be cited under the Fair Labor Standards Act from the Department of Labor. Okay, here's the next answers. Question number 3, nope. The second week hours were 44, so the employee must receive 4 hours of overtime for the second week, even though the pay period was 80. Remember, we were saying that each week stands alone. So anything over 40 hours, you must pay time and a half. And then question number 4. Again, no. The 15-year-old employee can only work 3 hours a night during the school week, not 4. So I could only work him 3 hours. So, are there any questions on the material today? Okay, here's my references for the class, and I want to thank you for your attention today.